para darnos un curso sobre la teoría monetaria del dinero. Y le voy a dar la palabra al doctor Eric, que está aquí con nosotros, que es el coordinador del posgrado de Economía en el Instituto de Visiones Económicas.
Sí. Bueno, antes que nada agradecer la invitación. Gracias, doctora Girón. Gracias, César. Doctor Gray. Por respeto al doctor, traje algunas palabras en inglés, a ver si me sale. Entonces, dear students, esteemed colleagues, and distinguished guests, it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this important occasion. Today, we begin a unique academic experience here at the Institute of Economic Research, where we are committed to broadening our understanding of economics through diverse and heterodox perspectives. On behalf of the graduate program in economics, IIEC campus, I am delighted to welcome to Professor Randall Gray, a leading scholar in the field of the modern monetary theory, MMT. Professor Gray's work was played a pivotal role in reshaping how we think about money, fiscal policy, and the functioning of the modern economics. We are fortunate to have him here with us to share his extensive knowledge and groundbreaking ideas. As a research institute dedicated to exploring heterodox economic theories, the Institute of Economics Research provides a platform where we challenge traditional views and critically engage with new economic models. Professor Gray's course presents an excellent opportunity for all of us to delve deeply into some of the most innovative and thought-provoking ideas in economics, particularly those related to MMT. I encourage each of you to approach this course with curiosity and critical mindset, engage actively with your peers, and take full advantage of this opportunity to further develop your understanding of economic theory. This course will not only enhance your academic knowledge, but will also provide you with the tools to think about how we can address today's economic challenge for fresh perspectives. Once again, a warm welcome to all of you. We look forward to the stimulating discussion and valuable insights that will emerge from this course. Thank you, and welcome, Dr. Randall Wright.
Bueno, nada más me gustaría agradecer primeramente al profesor Randall Roy por aceptar la invitación y a todo el apoyo que nos ha dado el Instituto de Investigaciones Económicas, ¿no? El programa de posgrado del instituto, y sobre todo a ustedes que están aquí o los que nos estén siguiendo vía remota, ¿no? Les agradecemos el interés en el curso y estamos seguros de que va a ser todo un éxito.
Muy bien, pues muchísimas gracias, and the floor is yours, Brandon.
Well, let's see if I can stand up. Okay, so because there are 3 lectures, this one is going to start off very simple. And we're going to look at the nature and origins of money. And that will provide a framework for the other 2 lectures that come after this. Okay? So it will get a little more difficult as we go along. By the 3rd lecture, it will be much more complicated. This down so I can see. Okay, so let's begin the way that orthodox textbooks begin when they talk about money. They begin with the functions of money, which sort of makes sense, but I will become critical of this in just a minute. So what can you do with money? You can spend it. That's the medium of exchange function of money. And for orthodox economists, this is the most important one. You can pay bills with it, and I say including taxes because for MMT that's important. This is the means of payment function of money. You can save it. Okay, this is the store of value function of money. As Keynes remarked, in the neoclassical world, you would have to be insane to hold money as a store of value. Okay, you can hoard it, and that's just emphasizing that saving and hoarding, they are the same activity, but one of these is very positive and the other one is very negative, if you know the story of Scrooge. And then finally, MMT adds an important one that is always left out of orthodoxy. You can redeem it. And I'll talk more about what I mean by redeeming. And by the way, all of these cartoons were done by my former student Heskey, who is a great economist, but also turned out to be a very good cartoonist too. Okay, I come out of the institutionalist tradition. Dudley Dillard, who wrote the first honest book that was presenting Keynes's general theory accurately, as opposed to the way that Paul Samuelson did it, for example, or Hicks. Dillard said that money is the most important institution in the capitalist economy. Ag Foster is another institutionalist. He was at the University of Denver before I taught there. He died before I became an economist, but I knew his wife very well, and I know his tradition very well. For Foster, the word institution connotes patterns of correlated human behavior. So that's his definition of what an institution is. And remember, Dillard says that money is an institution. It does not pertain to non-human phenomena. So it has to be human phenomena. So money cannot be a thing. Things are not human behavior. Institutions concern human behavior. So what's the nature of the institution that we call money? Well, one commonality is that all monies are measured in a money of account. That money of account is socially chosen. Second, the nature of money has to amount to more than that if money is an institution. The most obvious shared characteristic is that they are evidence of debt. Well, debt is a human relationship. There's a debtor and there's a creditor. That's the human relationship. That's the institution. What we have is a socially created and generally accepted money of account, and I'll talk more about where that money of account comes from, and debts that are denominated in the money of account. Okay, and then the final point is, for institutionalists, institutions are always evolving. We don't know where they're going to go, but they change over time. And this institution that money represents has evolved over time. So let's go way back in time and ask, where did money come from? So Keynes has this nice sort of mystical quote, money's origins are lost in the mists when the ice was melting and the weather was delightful and the mind was free to be fertile of new ideas. Okay, sort of poetic. He goes on to say that the money that we have today has been around for 4,000 years at least. So we are talking about the distant past. And by the way, the term modern money theory came from this quote. I was trying to find a title for the book I was writing that was presenting what became modern money theory, and we called it Understanding Modern Money as an Inside Joke. What's modern? The past 4,000 years. This kind of money has been with us for 4,000 years. So it came from Keynes. So while we imagine that use of credit is a modern invention from time immemorial, most purchases were based on credit. So the way that orthodoxy presents it is money was a thing, okay, gold or something like that. And it's only recently that we substitute credit for money. That's false, okay? Credit is far older than coins. 4,000 years at least. Okay, so purchases were based on credit, not using coins, not using any medium of exchange. And that meant that someone had to keep records of debts. So if you got credits and debts, you have to have a way of keeping track of them. So writing had to be invented. And so it turns out that the history of writing and the history of money are very closely related. And we don't have good histories for most societies around the world that are complete records of this. The exception is in Mesopotamia. We have a 10,000-year unbroken written record. Okay, tying together the two, money and writing. If we go back 8,000 the year 8,000 BC, up to about 3,500 BC in Mesopotamia, what we find is these clay balls. They have a hole, which you can see, and inside are little tokens. The tokens are pushed through the hole, and then the clay hardens. So they have a record of clay tokens in the ball. And so later they would press the tokens on the outside of the ball, then push them in. Okay, now if there's any dispute about what's inside the ball, they break the ball open and they can count the tokens. The tokens look like what they represent. So there's a token for a sheep, a token for a goat, a token for a bushel of wheat. Okay, what were they doing? We don't really know. Okay, we can only look at the evolution of this. The next stage we see beginning about 3,200 BC, they dispense with the balls. And what they do is they can take a single token that represents, say, a bushel of wheat and press it 3 times. And that is tallying up 3 bushels of wheat. So they have a record. Still using different tokens for each different thing that they are trying to keep track of. So it's a kind of record keeping that we know. All right. About 3,000 BC, they realized they don't need to press tokens. They can use a stylus and draw on clay. Still keeping track. Okay, exactly what it is, we don't know. Until 2700 BC, it becomes much more stylish, still using a stylus, drawing. And these become the cuneiform tablets, which we can read. So we know what they were doing. The cuneiform tablets were all records of credits and debts. Okay? And so it is likely that's what this always was records of debts, and the holder is the creditor. Okay? It isn't, and they start also recording the lives of the pharaohs or whatever, okay? Start recording stories. But the writing is nothing like language. It's still representative, okay? It's only in 1500 BC that the alphabet is created and writing finally becomes similar to the way that they speak. And of course, that's the way our writing is today. But the point is that form of writing and writing poetry and things like that is extremely recent. Early writing had nothing to do with that. Early writing was invented by accountants, not by poets. Okay, that comes very late. Now, of course, humans had stories and they had poets, but they couldn't write it down. So it isn't until the invention of the alphabet. Relatively recent thing. All right. Oh, there it is. So where did the notion of keeping track of debts come from? We don't know for sure. Debts are at least as old as human beings. Okay. We know that chimpanzees have the concept of debt and keep track. Not with writing, they have to memorize it. So if a chimp assists you and helps protect you, that chimp keeps track. You owe me. And when I get in trouble, you better help me. Okay? Because that's a debt. You got to repay it. We know how tribal society worked. Tribal society did not have writing. But civilized people, and I don't mean civilization in the sense of nice people, because civilized people are not nearly as nice as tribal people. But say Roman society comes in contact with German tribal society. So the Germans were still tribal. Romans were civilized. Romans had writing, so they could write down what they saw. And they saw this tradition, and anthropologists know that this was common throughout all tribal societies. It's called Vergild just because that was the German word. Okay, so the Romans observed the Germans, and Vergild was the principle that if you caused an injury, you were in debt to the family of the injured person. And they had public assemblies that would decide what you had to pay for every possible injury you could inflict on someone. And they had a different payment. The payments were all in kind. In other words, it would be a goat, okay, for, say, a fairly serious infraction. It would be a horse for a really serious infraction, okay? So they had a list of fines for every possible infraction. Grierson, Philip Grierson, was a professor at Cambridge in England, and he was the world's authority on coins. And he had one of the greatest coin collections that anyone ever had. And when he died, he left it to Cambridge. And it's there if you ever want to go see part of his collection. He knew that money was thousands of years older than coins, because coins didn't come around till about 7th century BC. Okay. And again, money is at least 4,000 years old. So he speculated, where did money come from? We know it wasn't coins. It had nothing to do with precious metal. It had to do with keeping track of debts. He hypothesized that in tribal society, the payments are in kind, and there's no reason to have a single measuring unit. If you cut off somebody's arm, the debt is a goat. If you kill them, the debt is a horse. We don't need to compare those. Okay, we don't need any unit of account. But he hypothesized that as authorities got power within tribal society and eventually become rulers in civilized society, what they would do is demand part of the payment. Okay, and gradually over time, they would require more and more of the payment until we get to modern Western society. When you break the law, you drive your car too fast, okay, you have a debt to society, right? If you kill somebody, you have a debt to society. You don't have a debt to the victim. You have a debt to society. Grierson hypothesized that this was sort of the transition of the authorities taking the full payment of debts. The victims no longer get paid. And he hypothesized that the creation of a single measuring unit to measure all of these various infractions in terms of the fine you will pay was done as an economizing measure by authorities. Because in tribal society, there was no reason to do this. You're paying the victims. Okay? But if you create a civilized society with laws, what you want is a single measuring unit. So he hypothesized that it came out of the Vergild tradition, but it had to change substantially because governments don't want a chicken, a goat, a horse, and so on. Okay, so they created the money unit. So the money unit is a huge social, but also conceptual leap to go from measuring debts in terms of things that can be delivered to measuring debts in terms of a money of account. Humans had measuring units, okay? Pretty easy to come up with. The foot, you got a foot, okay? Maybe you can argue about whose foot you're gonna use. Slightly different sizes, okay? And we've all got an inch right here, and we've got a cubit right here. So, and weight units. Okay, so those are as old as humans. Humans came up with ways to measure things, okay? But it's relatively easy to come up with those measures. It's extremely difficult conceptually to come up with a measuring unit for things that have nothing in common. Okay, a bushel of wheat versus a horse. Okay, there's no obvious way to establish what the ratio is, right? So you come up with a measuring unit. All the early measuring units, the names for them were taken from measuring units for grain. So Keynes noticed this. He had his period that he called his Babylonian madness. He was going through the history as they knew it in 1919, trying to figure out where did these money units come from, okay? And realized they came from grain. So all of the early units, the shekel, the mina, the pound, the lira, they all came from weight units for grain. And then they're just borrowed. It's not that a bushel of wheat is money. It's we borrow the name because everyone knows the name, and that becomes the name of the money unit. Now you can measure it. All right, and then we have to have ways to keep track of the debt. Okay, you want it written down some way so that the creditor doesn't increase your debt through a faulty memory, okay, or through fraud. So you write it down. And I talked about the clay tablets. If you go to Europe, the main thing that was used was tally sticks. These are wooden sticks. They put hash marks across them, which are called scores. And in English, we still use the term. The football game yesterday, it's a score. That comes from scoring the wood, which means carving a straight line across the stick, and they would split it in half so that the debtor would keep half and the creditor would keep half, okay? And when they paid their debt, whatever it was, they would match them to make sure no one was cheating. So it was a record keeping and making sure that you couldn't have cheating. And that probably was also true of the clay tablets. The clay tablets often were encased inside another piece of clay. And just like those clay balls that could be broken open to see how many tokens really were inside, you can break open the outer layer of clay and get inside the clay tablet to make sure no one has been counterfeiting or drawing additional lines. So the tally sticks did the same thing. So what is money? Money is an IOU. It's a record of indebtedness. And if we look at examples of the things we use as money, here is a US dollar bill. That is, we call it currency. It's an IOU. In the case of the United States today, it's always an IOU of the Fed, Federal Reserve Bank. The Treasury used to issue paper money too, and governments around the world, treasuries issue paper money. That is an IOU of the Treasury. So it's an IOU of either the Treasury or central bank, depending on which country you look at. In the old days, and old people like me still use them, we use checks. Probably none of the young people have ever seen a check. But what is that check? That check is your promise to pay, and your bank is actually going to make the payment for you. You write a check to pay your utility bill. You are promising the utility supplier that you're going to make that payment. But it's actually the bank that's going to make it using their own IOU. Okay, and now I guess everyone does this. I don't do it at all, but you can use your phone, and that's a promise to pay, and you have it connected to something, a credit card, debit card, bank account, that will make the payment for you later, okay? All right, the question always comes up, so I decided I will address it because I know it's gonna come up, and it's huge in the news now because of Trump. Okay, crypto. Is crypto money? And we can be definitive, absolutely not. Cannot be money. No such thing as crypto money. Okay, so what is crypto? It's a speculative non-money asset with little alternative use. That's all it is. Okay. The most famous speculative bubble in human history was a tulip bulb. Okay, these are less valuable than tulip bulbs because with a tulip bulb, at least you can grow a flower. You can do nothing with crypto. Okay, it's far less valuable than precious metal. It's not useful as a medium of exchange. So in the beginning, the claim was this is going to become the main medium of exchange. It cannot be a medium of exchange. It never has become one, and it will not. Okay, why can't it? Because when the value is rising, no sane person will use it to buy anything. Because it's going up in value. You'd be crazy to buy something with Bitcoin when it's rising. When it's falling, no one will sell anything for it. You'd be crazy because it's falling. Okay, and it's not stable. It's impossible to use it as a medium of exchange. Okay, it never will be. Yes, a speculator might bet the other direction. So now it's going up, you might want to short it. When it's going down, you might want to go long in it. Okay, but you're going to use the forward markets. You're not going to use the actual Bitcoin. That's why they're creating these futures markets. So you can place those bets. Okay, but you're still not going to be selling anything for it or buying anything for it. 90% of Bitcoins are held by 1% of the holders today. And Bitcoin is not a money of account. No one values Bitcoins in crypto. Okay, no crypto is valued in crypto. It's always valued in US dollars. Okay, it's not a money of account. Okay, and then gold. Because orthodoxy tells this story that's completely false. Okay? In a gold standard, gold is not money, never has been, never will be. Gold is not money. It's a speculative, non-monetary asset, but it does have alternative use. It's not going to go to zero. Okay, you can put it on your finger and you can put it in your teeth. There's always going to be some value for it. Now, the US and French and Russian governments could instantly cause a collapse of gold prices because much of the gold is locked up behind bars in prison, okay, at the Boston Fed and wherever Russia locks their gold up. If they released it, the price of gold would collapse, okay? But anyway, it does have alternative uses. People say, oh, I'm going to hold it as a hedge against inflation. It's a great inflation hedge. So whenever there's inflation, gold bugs start pushing up the price of gold. Okay, well, we'll take a little break here from what I want to talk about. Is it actually a good inflation hedge? So here is 100 years on the left. This is the price of gold, inflation adjusted. It goes up, it goes down. It swings wildly. Okay, here's the Dow Jones on the right. Again, adjusted for inflation. Yeah, it goes up, it goes down a little less wildly. But notice they start at about the same place. Gold ends up at less than $3,000. That ends up at $45,000. Okay. If you bought gold in 1980, its price fell and stayed below the 1980 price for the next 40 years. It was a loser for 40 years if you bought it in 1980. Even with the current speculative bubble in gold, it's now just equal to the inflation adjusted 1980 price. So only now today are you back where you were in 1980 in terms of inflation adjusted value of gold. If you bought the Dow, it's 10 times what it was in 1980. So which one is a better inflation hedge? Okay, only fools speculate in gold or crypto. Okay, fundamental principles of money, how to identify it. It's denominated in the money of account. This is almost always chosen by the state or authorities. There are a few historic counterexamples. Banks in Northern Europe got together and created their own unit of account for internal record keeping between the banks. Okay, so occasionally something like that happens, but otherwise it's always authorities, the king, the elected Congress, whatever. Second, it's an IOU of the issuer and it's an asset of the holder. Okay, gold is an asset. Okay, it's a physical asset, but it's nobody's liability. It can't be money. And then the third is that it's redeemed. The primary sense of redemption, which I think is the important one, and I'm going to go into it, is that you can return it to the issuer to cancel your debt. So redemption, you return to the issuer. That's redemption. The one that orthodoxy might talk about when they're talking about a gold standard is the secondary sense. When you're on a fixed exchange rate, the currency can be redeemed for that which it is to which it is fixed. So if you're on a gold standard, a strict gold standard, and the government issues currency and they have promised to redeem it for gold, you can redeem the currency for gold. Okay. If you're on a dollar standard, the government is promising to redeem their currency for US dollars. Okay. That's the second sense. That's the only one that's recognized by orthodoxy, but it's extremely rare to have a gold standard around the world today and also back through history. So most people who haven't studied this think, well, gold standards must have been normal until recently when the US went off gold in 1974. No, gold standards were extremely rare in history, and they never lasted long. A generation is about as long as a gold standard ever lasts because it collapses the economy and you have to get off it. There is one big exception, and that was Britain for about 400 years. And since Americans, of course, are sort of America descended from Britain, this plays a big role in their mind, but it was an aberration. Okay, it was a unique, sort of strange aberration that the UK did this. So anyway, the primary sense is the important one. It is universal. The secondary sense is not important. It's fairly rare, and no rich developed country today has redemption in the secondary sense. We all got rid of it when the US went off gold. Okay, so what's redemption? I like this example. This is Eric Timoin, who uses the pizza coupon example. So you have a new pizza restaurant, Joe's, and Joe issues these coupons for free pizzas and mails them out to the neighborhood. And you can bring your pizza coupon in and redeem it for a free pizza. Okay, that's redemption. What is the coupon? It's an IOU of the pizza restaurant. They're promising you a pizza. You redeem it for a pizza. Okay, you are redeeming that debt. The issuer has to take it back or it's a default. He says, no, I'm not taking that back. Okay, that's a default. All right, and maybe you can take him to court and get your free pizza. All right, what does Joe do with the pizza coupon when he gets it? Does he put it in the cash register next to the dollar bills and say, oh boy, now I've got more money in the cash register? No, because it's his own debt. When it comes back to him, what does he do with it? He throws it in the pizza oven. He burns it. Because once it comes back to him, it's just a scrap of paper. It has no value. When you get your own debt back, you throw it away. If you borrow sugar from your neighbor, you write, I owe you a cup of sugar. Okay. And when you deliver back sugar, you get your IOU back and you tear it up and throw it away. All right. So the IOU is only valuable if someone else has it. When it comes back to you, it has no value. Farley Grubb was also an expert on coins. Early American colonial coins. But he got involved in discussions of MMT with other people, and all the coins were British coins used in America. Okay, the American colonies were not allowed to coin money because Britain wanted the colonies to grow crops, sugar and so on, and ship it to England so they could make whiskey or whatever, rum. So they wanted Americans to work really hard to earn British coins by growing sugar and sending the exports. So they didn't want them to coin their own money because then they wouldn't need the British coins. Okay. Anyway, so Farley started looking and said, you know, actually, they also had paper money. And the colonial governments issued paper money. It's in the Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith wrote about it too. He said, there's this strange thing going on in the American colonies. They're printing up pieces of paper that have no intrinsic value. It's just pieces of paper, and people will accept it in payment. And as long as they don't issue too much, they retain their value. He said, it's very strange. So anyway, Farley Grubb started looking at the historical record. All 13 colonies did this. They all issued paper money. It was the first big issue of paper money in all of the West. China had paper money, but the West did not. China had it for a few hundred years before, okay? So anyway, Farley looked at it, and every colony kept careful records. They deviated a little bit in how they did it. So I'm summarizing. He wrote about North Virginia and North Carolina. And what he found was, so this is a generalization, the procedures varied a little bit. The paper money was created by colonial legislatures and directly spent through their respective treasuries. So what the legislature would do would be pass a law that allowed the Treasury to print up paper money up to 10,000 pounds, Virginia pounds. So we still use the British name, but it would be the colony of Virginia that was issuing the pounds. Okay, so they were permitted to issue 10,000, and then they would just spend them. At the same time, they would pass a second law that was a law to impose what was called a redemption tax. They used the word redemption. That means they knew what they were doing. Okay, it would be expected to raise about 10,000 pounds over the next 3 years. So what are they doing? They're matching them. Okay, the amount they're allowed to spend was equal to approximately the amount they expected to collect in taxes. All right, so every paper money act included new taxes, typically land tax and poll tax. Income taxes are very recent. The old taxes were head taxes, hut taxes, and import or export taxes, okay, because people didn't have money income. And it was hard to keep track. So you did not have income taxes. And so the number of years over which these new taxes were operative was chosen to generate enough funds to fully redeem the notes. So they want to make sure the notes come back. Now, what do they do with the notes? Okay, think about pizza coupons. Why would anyone accept the notes? Because they had to pay the tax. Okay. It was very hard to get coins. You could pay your tax with coins. That was allowed. But coins were always in shortage. That's why they created paper money. There weren't enough coins to go around. The government couldn't operate itself, and coins were always short. There was always a shortage. So they needed the paper money to pay the tax, and that allowed the government to buy things that it needed, mostly for war and defense against Native Americans and French Canadians. That's who the American colonies were fighting. So anyway, when they come back, the legislature burns all of them. And they keep careful records to make sure that they get burned. Now, why do they do that? Well, to stop corruption. Okay, once they're received back, you don't want them sitting in a closet somewhere where somebody might take them out and try to spend them. So they burned them. And typically 75% of the notes that were issued would come back in tax payment, and they would be burned. And the colonies kept record. I won't go into it. Farley Grubb writes that the population actually preferred the paper money over the gold coins. That's why they didn't all come back. So about 25% would stay out there and circulate in the economy in private hands. Okay, so the chicken and egg, which comes first, spending or taxing? The government has to spend first. Until the colonial government spent, there was no paper money to pay a tax. So spending has to come before taxing. You can't tax what doesn't exist. And they couldn't possibly have taxed in coins because there weren't enough. And by the way, redemption, of course, is a religious word too. That's not a coincidence. The earliest authorities were temples. Okay, and so you redeem, and in Aramaic, which is supposed to be the language of Jesus, in Aramaic, the word for sin and debt is the same. Sin and debt is the same. So your sin becomes your debt. All right, so we say for shorthand, taxes drive money. This is what Warren Moser said. That's Warren. In January of 1996. That's the date when MMT began. January of 1996. Warren came online in a post-Keynesian thought discussion group, and he said, taxes drive money, you got to spend before you can tax. Okay, and everyone's scratching their head, what on earth is this guy talking about? Of course the government has to have revenue before it can spend. He said, no, Government can't possibly have revenue until it spends because nobody has the currency. How can you pay a tax unless the currency has been spent? So he said, the need to pay taxes means that people work to get that in which taxes are paid. Okay, so you work to get money to pay the tax. When I talk about Minsky tomorrow, Minsky said the same thing. So another way of looking at it is money is scorekeeping in the big game. What's the big game? The economy. In a monetary economy, money is scorekeeping. Who's the scorekeeper? The banks. And yesterday there was the football. Usually I have trouble using the baseball metaphor, which I much prefer, but I won't here because you guys know what baseball is. Most countries, when I talk about baseball, they have no idea what it is. So it's a baseball scoreboard. I told you Heskey did the diagram. She didn't know anything about baseball. She's from the Netherlands, and she didn't realize a baseball game is not going to have a score of 21-14. That would be a very unusual baseball game. But in any case, the scorekeeper, if the home team hits another home run, the scorekeeper just increases the score to 15. Use keystrokes, goes to 15. Where does the score come from? Out of thin air. You don't have to take a point away from the other team and give it to the home team. The scorekeeper can never run out of points. They just keystroke them into existence. Okay? And my colleague, Matt Forstatter, put it this way. You can run out of innings. Okay? Usually you only get 9, but you can go to extra innings. Eventually you run out of innings. In other sports, you can run out of time. Baseball, you can't run out of time. It can go on forever if necessary. But football, you run out of time. But you cannot run out of runs. Okay. You cannot run out of inches. You can always find another inch. Okay. Maybe you run out of trees to measure, but you can't run out of the measuring unit that you use to measure the height of trees. You can't run out of a measuring unit. Money is a measuring unit. You cannot run out. All right, what is government debt? Government debt is our financial wealth. Everyone who is not the government, who holds government debt, is the creditor. So government debt identically has to equal our net financial assets. They are government owes us. That's what a government bond is. It's government owes us. The government can't run out of those as long as we're willing to have more assets. If we want more financial wealth, we're always going to accept more government debt. All right. Now let's step back, bigger picture, various heterodox approaches to money. Marx, Keynes, Veblen, and much later Minsky all had a very similar view that the kind of economy we live in is a monetary production economy. It's a monetized economy. And Marx called it MCM prime. So you start with money to produce commodities to make more money. Keynes called it monetary theory of production, and the early drafts of the general theory, which you can read. So this doesn't come through so clearly in the general theory. He dropped it as he refined the arguments he wanted to make in the general theory. So he sort of dropped the stuff that was in the early drafts that was very similar to Marx. Okay, monetary theory of production. That's what he was trying to write. And then finally, Veblen, theory of business enterprise. So all three of these, I think, are very similar. They all have the view that the kind of production we engage in a capitalist economy is monetary production. Producing the things that people want is sort of a side product. It's an unintentional product. What the capitalist desires is money. They could care less whether you have shoes, but if they can make money producing shoes, they'll make shoes. Okay? So satisfying people's wants and needs is not the intention. That is not the purpose of the kind of economy we live in. It might happen, it might not. It was more profitable to make money without producing things people need. That's what they will do. That's a monetary production economy. Okay, now the different heterodox schools focus on different aspects of this kind of economy we live in. So institutionalists, and Minsky started as an institutionalist at University of Chicago. And people who know what University of Chicago is like today, that will surprise you to hear that Chicago of Minsky's day was institutionalist. Okay, it becomes a real business cycle, rational expectations, Lucas, and before that, Milton Friedman, later, after Minsky had left. So anyway, they emphasize money is all bound up with power. Okay, access to money gives you power. And that power is to do good and bad. Okay, so power usually has a negative connotation, but it can be a positive connotation. If you have a democracy and your own money, that gives your government power to do things that help people. So power can be good. On the other hand, it also gives power to people like Musk. Okay, so good or bad. Money, I already said this was Dillard, is the most important institution. Post-Keynesians, I included Minsky here too, because of course he's also known as a post-Keynesian, and Davidson. It's all tied up with uncertainty. Now, Minsky and Davidson had different views of what that uncertainty was. But as Keynes said, no one outside an insane asylum would hold money if there was an uncertainty. So we write our contracts in money terms because it gives us more flexibility. That's Paul Davidson. So the emphasis is on uncertainty. Holding money quells the disquietude, that is Keynes. And then over the past, how many years is it now? 40. Post-Keynesians have developed the endogenous money approach, okay, which emphasizes the fact that central banks cannot control the money supply. Money is created by banks. And I'll talk more about that later. Okay. Chartalists or state money approach. This, well, the person who's given credit as the father of this approach is Knapp. You also find it in Keynes. You find it in Charles Goodhart. You find it in Minsky. But I think the single best exposition of the state money approach is not by Knapp. Knapp's book is like 600 pages. It's almost impossible to get through. He invents so many words. You have to try to keep track of what all these new words mean. The best, 2 articles by Innes, 1913, 1914. 2 best articles ever written on money. This guy was the Queen's ambassador to Washington. He wrote very few other things. He wrote a book on beekeeping for the Queen. He wrote a book called Martyrdom in Our Times, which was on Western incarceration using prisons, which he opposed. And then these 2 great articles on money. Very strange that this guy came up with this apparently independently. So I'll talk more about him. So state money, the state's money is all bound up with sovereignty, giving sovereign power. Functional finance. Abba Lerner is best known for this. I will be talking about Minsky's views of functional finance. One of the other lectures I don't remember. But what this does is it combines the state money approach. Lerner also wrote a very good paper on the state money chartalist approach and government spending. Functional finance says that the proper fiscal balance is the one that achieves the functional purpose that you're trying to achieve. Full employment is what he advocated. Okay. And then sectoral balances. Godley is the best known exponent of this. Minsky never presented it completely like Godley did, but it's very clear that it was all straight in Minsky's mind. One of the first times that I met with him in his office and I was explaining my views on something, he said, go home, discipline it with balance sheets, come back with the balance sheets, then we can talk. So he was always doing that, making sure the balance is actually balance. Okay. So he understood all that. Anyway, all those things together, that's where modern money theory comes from. It combines all of these into our approach. Okay, Keynes and state money. I read the treatise on money when I was in Bologna writing my dissertation. And that's where I first came across the state money approach. And then I read Knapp after Keynes. The money of account comes into existence along with debts. He distinguished between money and the money of account by saying the money of account is the description or title, and money is the thing that answers to the description. I don't like the word thing because it implies it has a physical existence. Of course, keystroke credits to electronic balance sheets don't have any physical existence, okay? So I would prefer not to use thing. And then this is the quote that modern comes from. The state claims the right to determine what thing corresponds to the name, that is, which currency will be the dollar, and to various declarations from time to time. That is, when to say it claims the right to re-edit the dictionary. This right is claimed by all modern states for some 4,000 years at least. Okay, Keynes was pretty close. Graeber says 5,000 years. Okay, more modern research, 5,000 years. Okay, Innes, who I was talking about, these are mostly from 1914 article where he does a better job of linking the state and credit money. So we have the state's money and then we have private credit money. The state enforces the dictionary. That's using Keynes's words, not Innes. By imposing a tax liability, ensuring the money it issues denominated in that unit is generally accepted by agreeing to accept it in tax payments. Whatever the state will accept. Okay. The very nature of credit throughout the world is the right of the holder of the credit, the creditor, to hand back to the issuer of the debt, the debtor, the latter's acknowledgement or obligation. So that's the right of redemption. If you have someone's debt, that debtor must accept it back from you in payment of your debts. If you owe the government money, in taxes, the government has to accept back its own liability in payment of taxes, or it's defaulted. It's broken this fundamental law. Government money is redeemable by the mechanism of taxing. So that's what taxation is all about, is to redeem the currency. It's the tax which imparts to the obligation its value. So it's because you have to pay a tax, the government's money has value. A dollar money is a dollar not because of the material, so it doesn't matter if the dollar IOU is printed on a precious metal coin or a piece of paper. Okay, a dollar of money is a dollar not because of the material, but because of the dollar of tax that's imposed to redeem it. So summing up, What is money? It's a social unit of measurement. It's the state money of account. We designate as, I like money records better than money things. The IOUs, debts or liabilities denominated in the money of account. These money records fulfill the traditional functions of money that we started with. Okay. There is a hierarchy of monies. So Minsky talked about a pyramid. The government's liabilities are at the top. They're the most widely accepted. Below that, banks. Banks are special. In most countries, the government stands behind the banks. You have some kind of deposit insurance and you have regulation. So they are the most acceptable. Private liabilities, below that, you have non-financial businesses that issue, say, corporate bonds. They're a bit more risky. They are less acceptable. And then at the bottom, we have households. All right. Sovereign currency. The use of the currency and value of money is based on the power of the issuing authority, not on intrinsic value. What is the currency? It's records of debts, and there's a promise to redeem them behind the debt. Goodhart wrote a series of papers, 1996 to 1998, all on this theme. When you look around the world today, and as far as you can go back in history, what you usually find is every country has its own currency. It can't be a coincidence because it's too common. There's hardly any exceptions. So why is that? It's because having your own currency is all tied up with sovereign power. If you don't have your own currency, you don't have sovereign power. Taxes drive money. The state imposes an obligation payable in its state's own money, things, or records. When taxes are paid, both the government and taxpayer are redeemed. So the redemption is always simultaneous. You are redeemed, you don't owe taxes anymore. The government is redeemed, it doesn't owe you anything anymore. So there's a simultaneous redemption. There are always 4 entries on balance sheets, okay, and all 4 are canceled. Quadruple entry. People talk about double entry. No. If you're doing money, it's quadruple. There have to be 4 entries. Simple model. The government spends its currency received by the subjects. This would be a king, but it could be a democracy. Okay, the government and the citizens. And then the citizens or subjects pay taxes. What is bank money? Bank money is a liability issued by banks, often endorsed by the state. A firm has to borrow, issue IOUs to start production. So that's the first step. Money's involved in production, and it's going to be borrowed money. It's going to be bank money. Whether that firm did the borrowing or someone else did the borrowing, all bank money is created through loans. So somebody borrowed. That starts the production process. Lending effluxes money, that is, puts money into the economy. Repaying refluxes money. This is the circuitous approach terminology. Takes the money out. Redemption always follows creation. So it's true of the government. It's also true of the banks. They got to put the money in before they can take it out. You can't repay loans unless the banks have put money into the economy for you to repay the loans with. Central bank. Central banks originally were created to make payments by and to the state. The first 2 central banks, Sweden and UK, very clear this is why they were created. They weren't created to regulate banks. They weren't created as lender of last resort. They were created to make payments for the government. That's why they were created. Banks hold some central bank liabilities for clearing, and we have this notion of fractional reserves. The whole deposit multiplier story is wrong, but it is true. Banks hold some reserves to make payments to each other. The central banks discovered that because of this, they can be lender of last resort, and they can stop runs on banks. This recognition didn't occur till the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century. So central banks have been around since the late 1600s. It isn't until 1850s that they start acting as lenders of last resort. So that's relatively recent. In the United States, we were an exception. We didn't have a central bank till 1913. And our central bank was explicitly created to ensure par clearing between banks. So our central bank was not created to fund the government. It was created to solve the problem of financial crises when there were runs on banks. Central banks can lend or spend their liabilities, which are reserves, into existence. So how does spending occur today? And this is the typical model for most countries. And I had looked at Canada and the United States, and then now I've had students who go out and look at their own countries, and they find out, wow, it's the same. Okay, so this is pretty much the story of all modern governments. So the Treasury is tasked with spending. In the United States, Congress tells the Treasury how much to spend and what to spend on. So Congress orders it, and then the Treasury does it. But the Treasury actually doesn't make any payments. All the payments are made by the Fed. It's the central bank that makes the payments for the Treasury. And the way that they make those payments is that they credit a bank's reserves. That's how the payment is made. And then the bank credits the deposit of the account of the recipient. So in my diagram, it's a contractor. The government has hired a contractor to build a bridge. Okay. And that was authorized by Congress. The Fed will make payments to the contractor's bank's reserves, and the bank makes payments to the contractor's demand deposit. Okay. The Treasury orders the central bank to make the payment. Now, the contractor might receive a Treasury check or might just receive an electronic payment. Those details don't matter. The point is, all government spending increases bank reserves, dollar for dollar or peso for peso. If the Treasury is spending, the central bank will credit bank reserves by that amount. Taxes are just a reversal of that process. When you pay your tax, maybe you send a check to the Treasury or it's an electronic payment, your bank's reserves are debited and your bank account, your demand deposit, is debited. That's how taxes are paid. Okay. So if the government spends more than it taxes, that means bank reserves are going up and deposit accounts are going up. If the government spends less than it taxes, bank reserves are declining and deposits are declining. Okay. And this is the way that all governments spend now. So summing up, MMT views of central banks. Central bank facilitates payments by and to the state. Payments by the state efflux money, puts it into the economy. Taxes reflux money, takes it out. Taxes do not finance government spending. Government spending is financed by the central bank. Always, every dollar, the central bank credits bank reserves. That's how all government spending is financed. Bonds, now the taxes are for redemption, not for revenue. Bonds do not finance the deficit. Okay, it's already financed by the efflux of central bank money. Bond sales logically have to come after, because what do bond sales do? If a bank buys bonds, their reserves are debited. If you buy bonds, your deposit account is debited and your bank's reserves are debited. So it doesn't matter who buys them. Bond sales simply reduce bank reserves. That's all they do. You have to put the reserves in first before you can sell the bonds. Banks can't buy them, you can't buy them unless the reserves are put in first, because it requires reserves. Okay. So normally you sell bonds to remove reserves. Quantitative easing was this bizarre thing, craziness, because all it did was take the bonds back out of the economy and put reserves in. So the bank sat there with literally trillions of dollars of excess reserves, just sat there in the banks. Okay, it did nothing else for the economy. So what are taxes for? Beardsley Rummel, he was one of the Franklin Roosevelt's New Dealers and chairman of the New York Fed. He also happened to be the father of income tax withholding. He wrote after the war, after World War II, he gave talks and he wrote 2 papers. He said, the war has taught us that taxes are obsolete as a source of revenue. That's what we learned from the war. We don't need taxes for revenue purposes, okay? Which was obvious. The budget deficit was 25% of GDP. So everyone understood this. Taxes are not for revenue. Instead, taxes serve other purposes. They remove private demand to free resources for government programs. So during the war, we needed to reduce private spending so the government could spend more because we needed resources for the war effort. Taxes reduce private spending. That's what it's for. It's to take your income away so you can't buy things. That's what taxes are for. It reduces inequality of income and wealth, so you can tax the rich. It distributes cost to beneficiaries of a government program. So typically we have a gasoline tax. So the people who use highways have to pay for it. Does the government need the money? Of course not. It's to make you pay for it. So if you're going to vote for more highways, you also are voting for more taxes, okay, on your gasoline. And finally, to punish bad behavior, so you tax smoking and encourage good behavior, you give tax credits for buying EV cars. So what's the logic? You spend, then tax. You can't take out of the economy what you haven't put in. Taxes are paid by debiting reserves. The only sources of reserves are the Treasury spending, central bank lending, or central bank buying. What do central banks buy? Government bonds. And after the global financial crisis, mortgage-backed securities. Okay, so they do spend too. You have to put the reserve rabbits in the hat before you take them out. Like the magician, when he pulls the rabbit out, you pretend like you're surprised, but you know he put the rabbit in, right? No one believes that it's magic. And the strange thing is that if you all were post-Keynesians and I asked you, which comes first, investment or saving? All of you will say investment because you learned that from the general theory. Spending injections have to come before saving leakages, right? But then when I say which comes first, government spending or taxing, all the post-Keynesians will say taxes. Government needs revenue. Taxes are leakage. It's impossible. It's logically impossible. Government spending has to go first. That's the injection. There's no difference in this. All post-Keynesians can understand the first one. None of them can understand the second one. It's the most bizarre thing. I don't know why. Okay. People always object. Well, if you tell the politicians this, what are they going to do? They're going to spend like crazy. And you're going to get massive inflation. They're going to put so much money into the economy. It will cause inflation. Or, which I think actually is likely, financial instability. Okay, so we have to deal with those things. Government's unconstrained money printing is going to cause hyperinflation. The mainstream all thought that the quantitative easing, putting all those reserves in banks, is going to put so much money into the economy, we're going to get hyperinflation. We said, of course not. None of those reserves are going to get out of the banks. Okay, they can't possibly cause any inflation, and they didn't. This story is just wrong. All the money that is anywhere came from somewhere. And it's going to stay in the economy until it's destroyed in redemption. Redemption takes it out of the economy. All spending is financed. Government spending is financed by the central bank. Your spending is financed by your bank. Okay? All the spending is financed at the point when the spending occurs. Most of it can be traced back to a private bank or the central bank. So the spending can be traced back to a private bank or a central bank. But it's not the money that causes inflation. it's too much spending. Money is always innocent. Money cannot cause inflation. Okay, so Musk is going to go to Mars. He fills a spaceship full of quadrillions of US dollars, okay, that are all printed up, and he sends them to Mars. How much inflation do we get? It's not a trick question. We get none. They're all on Mars, okay? The money can't cause any problem. What if he brings them all back and starts spending like crazy? We get inflation. Spending can cause inflation, money can't. Okay. So too much spending can be a problem. And we'll get more into that later. So I'll stop there and take whatever questions. The one on the left is the new book. I had you read a more difficult article on combining the state and credit theories of money that has lots of history in it. So that's in the book on the left. That'll be out in the spring. The other one is more the stuff I talked about today. Okay.
¿Preguntas?
Thank you very much, Dr. Ray. I have a question. I remember that Vergild once says that money, the principal function of money is embodied in the gains of firms. It's not just the point you mentioned, but also to embody, to represent gains. Does it change in any, does it change the modern money theory principles that consider that money can be taken, can be in any form, including Bitcoins, if it represents gains?
So tulip bulb prices were bid way up, okay? You know, a tulip bulb was worth far more than a house. What did it represent? Well, if you could sell the tulip bulb to a greater fool than you could have money and then you could buy a house. Okay, that's what it represents. So if you can find fools to actually give you money instead of tulip bulbs, you can buy stuff. Tulip bulbs by themselves, the only value is you could have a flower. That's all. So it has gone up, but what has it gone up relative to? Money prices. Okay. And so then you could buy the house. But by itself, would you rather have the tulip bulb or the house? Which one of those is going to actually satisfy your needs? And if you're an issuer of Bitcoin, well, no, let's not use that. That one is a little more complicated because you have to mine them, right? If you're Trump and you're issuing Trump coins, okay, the cost is zero and your potential gain is pretty much unlimited. I mean, it's only limited by the number of fools out there and the prices they will pay. And then he can take that money and actually buy stuff. But as I said, you can't really buy things with crypto because it's a really bad medium of exchange. It's either going up in value or going down. And so either the buyers or the sellers will never use them as a medium of exchange. And that's what we observe in the real world. They're not used. There's always been this claim they're going to, take over. Not going to happen. Hasn't happened. And I noticed that all the promoters have stopped making that claim because it didn't happen. So they no longer say that that is the advantage. It's a perfect medium of exchange. No, they don't make that claim anymore.
Well, thank you, Professor, for the presentation. And actually, I have two questions. And the first one is about the, like you say, the money, it's a social relation, and it's a kind of institution that came from the social order. My question is that if MMT proposes that the money or this increase of money, or in a better way, that the government is spending doesn't have a restriction, a real restriction. What do you think about this debate with the bullionist, with Ricardo, when it says that the money that is circulating in the economy has to correspond with the gold, actually, the gold in the like a stock. And what do you think about this restriction is not from economic real or economic relation, but a social one? Because I mean, last year in Mexico, we have an experience with the deficit spending in the government, and we have 5% of the deficit. This is not a crazy number. It's just 5% of the in comparison with the GDP. But the regular deficit is 2.5%. And I mean, the restriction wasn't real in terms of the economy. We don't have inflation related with this increase of the spending. But we have a restriction from the ratings agencies like Fitch that decreases the rate of the government debt. So my question is that if money is a social relation, don't you think that the restriction is a social one and not an economic one? And the other question that I have, it's about the quadruple accounting balance, because I mean, I think that we can talk more in the other sessions, but I understand that we have two transactions in an accounting balance, which is an asset, like that you said, is the holder of the IOU, and the issuer of the IOU has a liability. I understand that the bank has the power to erase the original IOU, and my question is, that would be the third movement in the accounting, and what would be the fourth one? Because I have no doubt about it. Thank you.
So lots of different topics. Do we need to restrict government spending? Of course we do. Okay, even if our elected representatives aren't, crazy, trying to cause hyperinflation and so on, we still need to restrict them. Budgeting is a good idea. The budget restricts them. In the United States, we have a budgeting process. We have a dozen or more different programs. We have a budget law that is passed by Congress every year, although they have trouble passing them past 10 years. When they don't pass, it's called continuing resolution. So it is whatever the last one they ever passed, it's that one, okay, if they can't agree. But anyway, that allocates funding by program, and Treasury is to spend that. Now, Trump is trying to stop Treasury from spending. This is most likely unconstitutional, but we'll see what happens. But they not only can you, but you're supposed to spend the money, okay? That's a budgeting process. Budgeting is good. Why? Well, the head of every budget, every government agency would like to grow. It's natural. You become more important. You've got more employees. You can do more good things. But we don't want them to make those decisions. We want to constrain them. We're going to say, no, your budget is $10 billion. So you put a budget on them. You're constraining them. Budgets constrain, and they're good. Okay, in a democracy, it's supposed to represent what the voters elected you to do. So you do want to constrain them. You don't want to constrain them by arbitrary limits, okay, which we have in the United States. We have a debt limit. And so in recent years, what happens is midway through the year, you reach the debt limit. So the debt limit is 32 trillion, let's say. You can't have more than $32 trillion of government bonds out in the economy. And we've had that debt limit since 1913. So the same year the Fed was created, we put a debt limit on. Whenever we went up to the debt limit, Congress would agree to raise the debt limit. So that's what we did. Okay. Every time we have a war, we got to increase the debt limit a lot because the government spends a lot on the war and we have more debt out in the economy. It used to not be such a political issue. It's a huge political issue now. And even mainstream economists in the United States say it's crazy to do this. Congress already allocated the money. Congress already told the Treasury how much to spend. And then we say, oh, but hold it. We reached the debt limit. You can't spend what we told you to spend. Okay, this is just stupid. Only the US and I think Denmark has it. But in Denmark, the debt limit automatically increases as the debt increases. So it's not really ever binding. So that kind of limit makes no sense. Now, many economists think a debt ratio or a deficit ratio. So you were talking about the deficit ratio. It makes sense to put those on. So Euroland put a 3% deficit ratio on and a 60% debt ratio on. We wrote at the time, this is crazy. Okay, you guys are not going to be able to do this. It's going to cause a crisis. And it did cause a crisis. And finally, Draghi had to say, whatever it takes. Okay, forget those things. We will do whatever it takes. We're going to buy your debt. All right. Now, why can't you limit countries to a deficit or debt ratio? Because the deficit is not discretionary. The deficit is determined by economic performance of the economy. If your economy slows down, your deficit ratio will go up. And your debt will accumulate. Your debt ratio will go up. It's not under the control of your elected representatives. So to understand why it's not discretionary, we have to go through sectoral balances, okay, which we didn't do today, but we'll do it, I think, tomorrow. So I'm not going to go into it in detail, just saying it's not discretionary. So let's say you had a 2.5% deficit ratio limit, and what the government must do is increase tax rates when you start to exceed it. What's going to happen? Your economy is going to slow down because taxes take purchasing power out of the economy. Your deficit ratio will go up, not down. If you increase the taxes, deficit ratio will go up if you're growing too slow. Okay. And on the other hand, if the deficit is too low and you give big tax breaks, the deficit ratio might even go down. It's hard to know. If you really stimulate the economy, the deficit ratio will go down. So it's mostly not controllable by spending or by taxing. It's not a choice. All right. So that's why it's not going to work. Do you face a real restriction? Yes, you do. The government can purchase all the unemployed domestic resources. So usually labor is the big problem. The government can always afford to hire all the unemployed and give them jobs. Plus, you can buy foreign resources to the extent that other countries want your currency. Okay, so you can import too. All right. Beyond that, if you try to spend more, you're going to get inflation. So once you've exceeded the domestic real resources that are available and all the foreign resources you can buy because other people want your currency, then spending beyond that is going to be inflationary. So the real limit leads to inflation. So you do need to worry about real limits. The bullionist story is that I'll give a brief explanation, but the long version is in the paper that you can read. Typically, if you go back to the Age of Conquest, which was when all the European countries are fighting each other, mostly to get gold. And they're fighting each other using gold. Okay, because they have to hire the armies. If you're Britain and you're fighting France, you don't have B-52s to deliver supplies and troops for the war effort. You hire mercenaries in France and you provision them by buying supplies in France. Okay. Now, can you use British money? Okay, British coins. Well, it's problematic because what if you hire these mercenaries and Britain loses the war and is taken over by France? What is that money going to be worth? Whatever it's worth as precious metal. It'll have no value as money. It will become bullion. Okay? So if you're going to hire mercenaries, you got to pay them in gold coins because it's too risky. They're not going to take an IOU, okay, IOU, because that king could be deposed and it's his IOU. So they were used in war and for buying stuff that's coming from other countries. That's why they wanted bullion. They completely understood the principle of fiat money. Okay. They knew that their domestic population could be forced to take fiat money. Coins whose nominal value was very much greater than the value as metal. Domestic people will take that because they can pay their fees, fines, and taxes with it. The government will accept it. Okay. But mostly kings spent domestically with tally sticks, not coins. Most purchases domestically by kings was with sticks that had no value except as debt. And they would accept them back in tax payment. So the king could buy that wagon with a tally stick, and then taxes would be paid with a tally stick. The exchequer would go from village to village to collect the taxes and match the tally sticks, the stub and stock to make sure that no one is cheating. That's how domestic economies operated, on the basis of tally sticks. But for war, you needed gold or silver. So that's why bullion was so important. Now, I hinted, Britain was a very strange exception. With the two things happened. One was there was a reform. Elizabeth II, I'm American, so I didn't have to memorize all the kings and queens of England. But I'm pretty sure it's Elizabeth II who reformed the monetary system, and she tightly pegged the value of the pound to gold, and later it was changed to silver. And for 400 years, the pound was fixed to gold or silver. 400-year experience of a metallic standard that was held very tightly Now, there's no pound coins. There's no pound paper money that's being used. Pound was only a measuring unit. The measuring unit was constant, but people use shillings, okay? And those could change in value, but the pound was fixed. And that paradoxically is what eventually ended up becoming the sovereign monetary system based on fiat money. It built so much trust in the British pound that they never abandoned this peg, that the pound became eventually the global currency by the 19th century, the international reserve currency, because people trusted it. The other thing that happened was that Charles II, I think it was dumb enough, about 200 years later, dumb enough to default on his tally sticks. He had spent tally sticks buying stuff that he needed, mostly high living. Kings like high living, right? High living standards. And when people tried to pay their taxes, he refused to accept them. Parliament was so mad that they invited William of Orange to come over and had a coup, threw him out. And then to make sure that William of Orange didn't do dumb things, they put him on a budget that was fairly small. And they said, Parliament is going to fund you. You're not going to fund yourself. You're not going to be issuing money and debt unless we approve it. Parliament took control of the monetary system and created the Bank of England. So 1692 or something like that. They create the Bank of England. That's to fund the government. Bank of England could issue debt, but not, the king did issue, they allowed him to issue some, all bought by the Bank of England. And the Bank of England issued its debt against the king's debt. And they started issuing paper money. Okay? And then gradually they took control of the whole banking system. They became the central bank at the top of the money pyramid. And so the king has no control over the monetary system anymore. It's Parliament. There's trust in the pound, and Parliament is budgeting. And they had debt ratios, I don't know the exact numbers, over 200% of GDP, common. Okay. Today we think, oh, 100% of GDP, that's terrible. The government's going to have to default. Medieval governments and all the way back to city states, they had debt ratios of hundreds of percent of GDP. Okay. Because wars were extremely expensive, and kings' taxing power was very low, very hard to collect taxes. Okay. People didn't trust the king. They didn't like the king. Everybody's trying to evade and avoid taxes. Their ability to tax was very low, but their need to spend was very high. Every time there was a war, that would be 90% of government spending would be for the war. And so they get heavily into debt, and then they would default on the debt. So it's crazy to think that 100% debt ratio by a modern democratic government with huge ability to tax, European countries 50% of GDP. The US is a lot lower, maybe 1/3 of GDP we can take in taxes. Our taxing ability is huge. And we don't default like kings did on their debt. I think I only went through 2 questions. So let me just do 2 more. Ratings agencies. Ratings agencies have no idea what they're doing, except they're pretty good at rating municipal bonds. That was their main line of business. They do okay on that. Rating a city government's creditworthiness. They're pretty good. Back when they downgraded Japan in the 90s, I wrote to, I think it was Standard and Poor. They're downgrading Japan. And so I wrote to them, I said, do you really believe the Japanese government is going to default on its debt? It took a while, but I wrote to several of them, but one of them wrote back, that is not what we're rating. When we rate a government's debt, it's not default that we're worried about. It is other things like maybe inflation or currency depreciation. So it's extremely misleading to say this is a credit rating. That's not what they're rating. And that's what they will tell you privately. We do not credit rate sovereign governments because of course we know they're not going to default. Okay? So it's very misleading. The other thing they cannot do is rate mortgage-backed securities, which we found out. The whole global financial crisis was caused by credit ratings agencies who had no idea what they were doing, giving AAA ratings to tranches and so on. So complete frauds. Don't pay any attention to them. Quadruple entry is pretty simple. You look at a T account of a bank and a T account of the borrower. The bank's asset is the loan. The bank's liability is the demand deposit. The borrower's asset is the demand deposit. The borrower's liability is the loan. There's 4 entries. When you repay the loan, all 4 are gone.
When you were talking about the central bank, I was just, I lived 1982. It was the 4th of August of 1982, when the Minister of Hacienda make a big conference at 10 o'clock at night in the most important channel of TV. And he said that we have a problem of caja because many people, well, there was a few of dollars to the USA banking system. And I remember that Rosario Green, who was an specialist in external debt, said that the Bank of Mexico, the plane, maybe in that time they had a plane, the Central Bank of Mexico had a plane, and they said that they were taking the dollars so they can sell the pesos and dollars and give those dollars to the people. But in that time, we didn't have reserves, and the reserves that we have were in gold, and I think most of them were in the Federal Reserve. So how can you explain all this problem? Because after to resolve the external debt of Mexico and later on Brazil and Argentina, we made between 3 and 4 renegotiation of the external debt, and of course with a very deep austerity programs. So in that time they were called standby programs. And we reduced all the social budget, the public job, but we never reduced the financial costs. And I think this is one of the traps that we have in Mexico until today. We haven't resolved why we have to pay the external debt costs to those institutional investors. Well, in that time were the commercial banks. And I remember that it was, I think was Reed, or I don't know, John Reed, the principal of the Citibank, who was in charge of all to renegotiate external debt with the IMF, with the World Bank, and with the Mexican government. So how can you explain this? Why do we have to pay all this external debt that most of them are in private banks of USA or in Switzerland or whatever. I just can't understand why the Mexican government can renegotiate. Well, they did a very well renegotiated in 1982 and during the 80s. But now the government still is paying the high cost of the debt. So how can you explain that?
Well, so you know, Jan Kregel has written a lot on Latin American debt, and he says in most cases the financial position is what Minsky called Ponzi. That your earnings of dollars aren't enough even just to pay the interest, and so the debt continues to grow, and sort of the structure of the financial position is one in which you have issued debt in dollars, but you can't earn enough dollars to make payments on that debt. So that's why you get in the position. I don't do international economics. Some of my students have done it, and some of them can address this much better than me. But my observation is that sovereign governments that issue debt in foreign currencies are almost always making a mistake because we don't have any international agreements on how to deal with over-indebtedness and default by sovereign governments. And so typically what happens is you get in a position with one of the international IMF agencies, and they then impose the kinds of conditions you're talking about where you can't grow. And so, of course, it's impossible for you ever to get yourself out of debt. So it seems to me the best thing would be for sovereign governments to avoid doing that. Now, a lot of sovereign governments get in debt in foreign currency because they take over the debt of private firms because they're worried about those failing. And that also is a problem because now the government has got debt that it can't pay either. It seems to me it would be better to let those firms fail because you've still got whatever productive capacity there is. It's still going to be there. The ownership is going to change. That seems to me to be a better solution than for the government to take on the debt. We need a whole reorganization of the international monetary sphere. That's very clear. And we have an opportunity that is an absolute necessity, which means maybe it becomes easier, maybe not. And that is the challenges that the whole globe faces today are more severe than anything humans have ever faced. So climate catastrophe is the most obvious one, but it's not just that one. Rise of demagogues, fascists, inequality, and so on. But just focus on the climate one. So climate catastrophe. And the individual countries can't solve this problem. Because let's say that the US had a completely different administration and Congress, and they decided, we're going to solve the United States environmental problem. Well, it does no good if other countries around the world don't also come along because the climate's still going to be destroyed. We have to do it everywhere, all together, okay? So it has to be international agreement organized reduction of carbon emission. Everyone has to be on board, okay? And the second reason why it takes international coordination is because only the rich countries can afford to do it. If we leave the developing countries all alone, they're going to pursue the same path that we did, which is fossil fuel, because nothing is as cheap as burning coal. So they're all going to follow that path, which means, again, we're going to fail. It will do no good for the United States and Europe to clean up their energy if the developing world develops and starts spewing much more coal. So what I'm saying is the rich countries have to provide the funding. They also have to provide the advanced technology. So that's where it's going to be produced. China, mostly, United States, and other already developed countries. So we have to do it together. It takes a complete rethinking of international finance. Now, the United States, people will say, well, you know, we've already got a budget deficit. How could we afford to spend $2 trillion more to help the developing world? But what I'm saying is money is not the problem. If we know how to do it and we have the technology to do it, we can always afford it. Okay? The danger is inflation. But let's say we send $2 trillion to the developing world. Where is that demand going to show up? It's going to show up spread around the world. The demand for the imports to transition to sustainable growth. The demand is going to increase all over the world. It's not going to be $1 trillion or $2 trillion demand for US output. There's going to be a big demand for Chinese output, for Japanese output, for South Korean output. The demand will be spread all over the world. So the one fear that is legitimate, which is inflation, is not such a fear if you realize it's not going to be $1 trillion spent in the United States. It's going to be spread all over the world. And if inflation is the only setback, the only drawback of the US providing international aid, what I'm saying is it's not much of a threat to provide international aid. Now, the reason why the US doesn't meet its agreements, you know, the US never gives money that it already promised to give. The reason it doesn't do it is because it thinks it'll make the deficit too big. But what I'm saying is the deficit doesn't matter. What matters is inflation, and it's not going to be inflationary.
Good morning. First of all, thank you for coming. Thank you for your conference. I wanted to ask about, you showed a couple graphs comparing sort of gold and the Dow, as gold being a perhaps misunderstood hedge against inflation, with its ups and downs being even more radical than that of the Dow. And my question is, I guess, about the backdrop as far as the timelines, with obviously the post-war period in the US economy being an explosion of industrial production, then shifting to financialization of the US economy as the epicenter of where the economy is based, even measuring the health of the economy based upon the stock market. Also quite misleading. But I'm curious, my question would be, do you see those trends continuing in the future based upon a couple of factors? One, questions about the continuation of US hegemony, which allows for that stock market to be so thriving over the last 4 decades or so. Two, the shifts in, well, first, Russia decoupling from the US economy to a great extent. Second, China shifting away from US Treasury bonds, shifting towards purchases of gold. among other trends which are happening. And so I guess my question would be that sort of comparison as gold as a misunderstood hedge or as a misunderstood place of security as compared to the stock market or as compared to the US dollar. Do you see those trends continuing into the future? Thank you.
Okay. Well, again, gold isn't a financial asset, it's a real asset. And it's in somewhat limited supply. As the price gets higher and higher, we find gold resources that become economic, okay, and develop new techniques to extract gold that is, in very, very small quantities in sand or whatever. So we're always increasing the quantity, but it's not money. It's not a financial asset. The stock market is greatly overvalued. We are in the biggest bubble humans have ever seen. So do I think it's going to come down? Yes, I do. But I have to admit, I've been saying that for a long time. And we're on the third bubble peak. This has never happened. I have a friend, Frank Veneroso, who used to come to the Levy Institute, and he would say, this has just never happened before. You get a bubble, you get an echo bubble. That is typical, but the echo bubble is not quite as big as the original bubble, and then it doesn't happen. Okay, we had a bubble, we had an echo bubble that was higher, and now we have a bubble that's much higher. It's just never happened before, so it's impossible to say how much longer can it go on. It's gone on much, much, much longer than I expected. I thought the global financial crisis was it, but it came back. And financialization is part of the answer to that. We have increasingly divorced the monetary system from the real economic system. And what they are pricing is the ability to reap capital gains. So that's what is being priced. It has nothing to do with physical output. It doesn't even have anything to do with selling the physical output. It is the appreciation of financial asset values. That's what's going on. And because it has, there's nothing underlying, there's no analysis you can provide, it can keep going up like tulip bulbs did. There was nothing behind that anybody could explain. So as long as people think it can go higher, then you can buy now and sell later, you get capital gains. So I have no prediction where it will go and no good explanation for why it's going there. Do I have a policy to stop it? Yes. We have to definancialize the economy. We have to put constraints on what financial institutions are allowed to do. When the last time we had anything like this was 1929, we collapsed into the Great Depression. And then the New Deal put the constraints on the financial system, and those worked for a generation. The kinds of activities that had been engaged in the lead up to the Great Depression gradually returned, partly from innovation, partly from the rise of what we call shadow banks, which is the things that weren't regulated. And then in response to shadow banks, deregulating the banks. So typically, whenever the shadow banks got an edge, the banks would complain legitimately. Say, look, these guys are able to do this and we're not. And so we're losing out. So instead of regulating the shadow banks, what we did was we deregulated the banks. So that's sort of the history from 1970 to the current day. And now banks can do virtually anything, and they're going to go into crypto and help drive it up. So what do? We have to reverse that process. We should have done it with the global financial crisis, like Roosevelt did with the crisis of the 30s. And the reason for that is just political. Because if you're in a crisis, it's easier to say we got to do something. When you're in a boom bubble, the financial markets have too much power. You can't do it. So I'm not optimistic that we're going to do anything to solve the problem until it does collapse. But then what do? You constrain them, and you make finance focus on financing the activities that do improve people's lives instead of just financial activities that can reap capital gains, which is what we're doing now. So other than that, I don't know what you can say. I do believe it will collapse. It can go on longer than anyone thinks that it will. And so much of the economy and so many of the decisions that are made have to do with that financial sphere instead of the real sphere. And it's not getting better since the global financial crisis, and then in the COVID downturn, which is a very severe downturn. In some ways, we responded very well on the fiscal side to COVID, but we didn't do anything about the financial side.
I was thinking if we just give a break of 10, 15 minutes and then we come back to some questions. Vamos a hacer un break de 10, 15 minutos para que se ir al baño y seguimos con más preguntas, ¿les parece? Okay, just 15 minutes.
Okay.
That's okay.
You want to continue with
Bueno, ¿seguimos? ¿Tenían más dudas?
Well, hello. First of all, I'd rather thank you for your time of this course. It seems most likely that Mexican Central Bank, Banxico, has abandoned its first objective of price stability and had set it target it on financial stability. And this, I think this makes me wonder, what do you think? Well, yeah, what do you think we can, well, Mexico can do to redirect its target into a more growth center objective, maybe these proposals of double objectives, as much as growth and, well, growth and price stability. And what do you think we can do? I ask this most because the autonomy of the central bank here in Mexico, it seems that is an it's not really good for us to think about other proposals. And also, I think that we can see that in the last recent years, we've seen some like systematic changes in Mexico, talking about laws and regulations. And so I think that the other question that I have is if you think that autonomy is that important for a central bank, or we should like think more to, well, yeah, if we should set our target into changing the Mexican central bank into a government bank instead of a central autonomous bank. Thanks.
Okay, good. Good topics, and I don't think I'm covering those the other 2 days, so I'll spend some time talking about my view. And generally, I would say this is an MMT view of central banking. Central banks have no tool at all to try to stabilize prices. They don't have a tool. They used to think that they should stabilize the growth of the money supply. And this was Milton Friedman, who wanted to impose a rule such as the central bank will have the money supply grow at 4% per year. And he started this in the late 50s, and finally he got his way in 1979 in the United States and also in Britain, when the central banks were taken over by monetarists who announced money targets. And so in the United States, it was Volcker. Volcker comes in, and we had both high inflation and high unemployment at the same time, which sort of tells you the problem couldn't be too much demand because we had high unemployment. And if you want, I can go into my view of why we had high inflation. But he was going to control the money supply in order to bring down inflation. So he's focused on controlling the money supply. And what happens is the rate of growth in the money supply goes to 16%. About 4 times what Uncle Milton would advise, and inflation comes down. Okay, so it's pretty clear that growth in the money supply was not the problem because it went up and inflation came down. At the same time, interest rate went above 20%. Now, in some Latin American countries, 20% doesn't sound that high. But in the United States, this is extremely high interest rates. Our high rate would be like a 6. So it goes above 20%. And what it did was cause massive financial instability and a financial crisis. Can central banks cause financial crises? Yes, they can. All they have to do is raise the interest rate really quickly. That's what they did. They wiped out our thrift sector. So in the United States, we had, because of the New Deal, we separated our banking institutions into different groups. We had investment banks. They could do riskier stuff, but they were relatively unimportant in the post-war period. We had commercial banks that did the traditional banking stuff. They made commercial loans and issued demand deposits. And then we had the thrifts, or savings and loans, that made home mortgage loans and issued savings deposits. And they're typically small local organizations. What happened when he pushed the interest rate up was he killed all of them. They all immediately became insolvent because they had made mortgage loans at 6%. By the way, it was called 636 banking. 363 banking. You pay 3% on deposits, you earn 6% on mortgage loans, and you go golfing at 3 o'clock. Because that's all it took. It took hardly any skill to run a thrift because it was simple. Thrifts never failed. Homeowners never defaulted on mortgages because you'd lose your house. So they would never default. But suddenly, the thrifts had to pay much higher on deposits than they could possibly earn on mortgages. So they were insolvent. And so what we did in response was we deregulated them and said, you can do anything you want. Try to become profitable again. And so they engaged in massive fraud. And they were lending to drug runners, gun smugglers, Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders. I mean, the list went on and on, what they were financing. Anyway, and then they failed anyway, of course. And 1,000 of the top management of CEOs went to prison for the stuff they were doing. So that's what high interest rates do. Killed the home ownership sector because people couldn't afford 20% mortgages to buy a house, crashed the economy, crashed the financial system. That's how high interest rates work. And in the United States, when Powell, we got inflation from COVID. Where did the inflation come from? Oil, food, housing, and supply chains. That's where it came from. It wasn't too much demand. But Powell's hero was Volcker. I'm going to do what Volcker did because he brought down inflation by raising interest rates. And so they started raising rates. And of course, we had gotten used to nearly zero interest rates because of the global financial crisis. Government bonds were paying under 3%. Banks hold government bonds as a very safe, risk-free asset. And so immediately we got a financial crisis. We had the second, third, and fourth biggest bank failures in US history, all in a row. You remember Silicon Valley Bank, so that's the best known. So the banks start failing. That's what always happens. So what Powell did was he said, well, you know what? What we will do is buy your bonds, not at market price, your government bonds and mortgage-backed securities, not at market price, at the original face value, okay? They had gone down by something like $5 trillion in value because of the higher interest rates. Because if you're only earning 2.5 and the going interest rate is 4 on the safest stuff, of course, you have to sell those at a discount. They said, no, don't worry, we'll buy them. So they started buying these things, trying to prop up the system. So that's how they prevented the financial crisis from spreading through the whole economy, which is what would have happened. So raising rates doesn't really fight inflation, it causes a financial crisis. A financial crisis, if it causes a deep enough downturn, it will lower inflation. So that's how you do it. You cause a severe financial crisis because they don't have a tool to control prices. And if you think about what would be the dumbest policy you possibly could put in place in response to the deepest recession the US had ever had, which was the COVID recession. That was the deepest one we ever had. We just collapsed. Unemployment skyrocketed. The worst thing you can do is raise interest rates to fight a downturn that's caused by a collapse of the supply chains and by the collapse of the house building sector. We weren't building any houses, and we hadn't been building many. But now the interest rate is too high for developers to borrow to build houses. We had a severe housing shortage, so rents were going up. That was driving inflation. So anyway, raising interest rates was the worst thing you could do. What we needed to do was to provide income to people who lost their jobs, provide care to people who had COVID, who couldn't get out of the house, seniors who couldn't go shopping, too dangerous, and so on. We should have taken care of people instead, and then solve the housing shortage problem by building houses, and solve the supply chain problem by building new ports, or increasing our domestic capacity so we didn't have to rely on complicated supply chains. We needed to build, and that requires low interest rates, not high. So what can central banks actually do? I don't believe you should give them tasks they can't do. Okay, they can't fight inflation. They cannot fight unemployment. They don't have the tools to do it. So you don't give them those tasks. They set the interest rate. That they can do. Okay, and eventually, no central bank around the world believes anymore that they can control the money supply. Volcker helped kill that one. So none of them announce money targets. They don't target money supply. Now they have inflation targets. Okay, we need to give that one up too. They can't do that, but they can set interest rates. So what is a good interest rate policy? Low rates. Okay, we had low rates for 2 decades, never caused inflation. It reduced the cost of building, it reduces the cost of investment. It reduces the payment of income to already rich people, because who holds financial assets? Who benefits from high interest rates? Rich people. Okay, they own the financial assets. So of course they're always rooting for high interest rates. So it increases inequality. It hurts low income people who have to borrow sometimes. They have to pay higher interest rates. So we know they can set the interest rate target. We know they can hit the interest rate target. So the only question is, where should it be set? Should you allow your central bank to do it? Central banks are not elected. They don't represent the population. They represent, at best, bank interests. At worst, the financial sector, the non-banking financial sector, which is more dangerous than the banks. Banks do some useful things. Most of the financial sector does nothing that is useful. It's a net negative for the economy. It just sucks what Ricardo would call rent. Okay, an unearned reward sucks rent out of the economy. So high interest rates reward them. Who should set it? I think it should be democratically set. So this is a thing for Congress to decide. What would be a good interest rate? Many MMT people favor 0. I favor zero with the caveat that the government should still offer a positive rate on savings for, let's say, low to middle income people to encourage them to save and reward them to save. Because I think it is useful for low income people to save for their kids' schooling, save for their own retirement. So promote it. Let's give them the opportunity to buy special government savings bonds, which in the US we had. When I was a kid, we would take a quarter to school each week, and you put it in this slotted cardboard. And when you got $18.75, you got a $25 US savings bond that was good in 7 years. Okay, then you cash it in, get $25. So anyway, I think that's good. So I don't think it should be zero across the board. The government should still offer savings bonds, but have an income limit. So if your income is above, in the US, $50,000, you can't buy these things. Only people below that. Otherwise, zero sounds good to me too. Dual mandates. Read Jamie Galbraith. He's written on this recently because he was sort of behind this. Back when he was a very young economist, he helped write the Humphrey-Hawkins Act, which told the Fed that you've got to pursue full employment with reasonable price stability. Okay, so he was sort of behind this. The problem is they have no lever for price stability. They have no lever for reasonably full employment. They can't do either of those things. But this is where it came from. So in the US, we say we have a dual mandate, but actually they have a third mandate, which is also reasonable economic growth. Okay, non-inflationary economic growth. They don't really have a handle on that either, although lower rates will help a bit. Otherwise, those things really are fiscal policy. Fiscal policy can influence all three of those things. Okay, jobs, so solving the unemployment problem, aggregate demand, prices, and using fiscal policy to fight a recession, which we did with COVID. And that's what helped to bring us back. There is a myth that central banks are independent. Central banks cannot be independent. Central banks are the government's bank. They make and receive all payments for the government. They are not independent. The idea is that central banks can take away the punch bowl. So this was the famous metaphor from the early 70s, that the central bank is there in case your parliament or Congress goes crazy and starts to spend too much. The central bank is supposed to take away the punch bowl and prevent you from causing inflation. The reality is central banks can't refuse to make the payments. So what can they do? They can only raise the interest rate. But what the interest rate does is it increases government spending because the government has to pay more on the bonds. So it actually increases government spending. Instead of taking the punch bowl away, what you're doing is you're pouring more alcohol into the punch bowl, which could be inflationary. So they're not really independent. And our Fed will occasionally try to tell Congress that this is a myth. We're not independent. Bernanke, one of the results of Jamie Galbraith's work, though, was he also required, I mean, he didn't, but he wrote the law. The law requires the head of the Fed to go before Congress periodically and answer questions. And that was to make them appear before Congress and explain what they're doing and make them more open in their thinking. And then several other things happened after that that has led to the Fed being more open in what they're doing. You may not know this or remember it, but until 1994, the Fed never told us what its interest rate target was. We knew that they had given up money targets and they stopped announcing them. Congress was telling them, give us your money targets. And they said, we don't do that anymore. We don't target the money supply. We'll give you a target if you want, but we don't pay any attention to it. What we're doing is targeting the interest rate, okay? But they never announced their target. The Fed would meet almost once a month behind closed doors for 2 days. And I think it's 2 o'clock on the second day, they pick up a phone that's connected to a phone next door where all the newspaper reporters are sitting. And they would say, okay, we have made our decision, and our decision is to slightly increase the pressure in the money market. That would be what they told them. And then the reporters have to try to guess what that means. Increase the pressure slightly. Okay, rates are going to go up. How much? Everyone is guessing. But in 1994, they got caught in a white lie, or maybe even outright lie to Congress. And they decided, we better be more transparent and announce our targets. So since 94, they actually do announce the targets. So we know what they're doing. So all of that goes back to the meetings. Anyway, global financial crisis. The Fed is doing stuff it has never done before in the global financial crisis in terms of buying assets and lending reserves to a very broad base of the financial sector, way beyond banks, lending into the shadow banking sector, which is not regulated. So some people in Congress, especially on the Democratic side, were getting upset. Bernanke said, look, we are a creature of Congress. You don't like what we're doing, change the Federal Reserve Act. That's the law that tells us what to do. He was as clear as he possibly could be. We are not independent. You created us. You write the law. We will do what you say. Central banks are not really independent. It's a myth. They're no more independent than any other agency or department in US government. Now, Trump's trying to change all of this, where everything is controlled by the president. Okay, but still, they're not independent. All right. So what I would do is forget the dual mandate, forget the belief in independence. None of this is true. What they do is they target interest rates. Make your fight about what should the interest rate be. That's what the whole fight should be about. And should the central bank have complete discretion on this, or do you put constraints on them and say, okay, when you think it needs to go up, you can raise it, but you cannot raise it above 3%. When you think it needs to go down, you can lower, but it can't go below 1%. Something like that. Give them a range and let them make the choices in that range. What about regulations? So around the world, some central banks are involved in regulations, some central banks are not. In the United States, we choose the best of both worlds. Our Fed has regulation responsibility, but so does our Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, that insures the bank. And so does the OTC, Office of, what does that stand for? OTC, Office of, I can't remember, and Currency. So anyway, we have 3 regulators at the federal level, and then we also have state regulators at the state level for the state banks. And we also used to have a regulator for the, OTC is dead. That was the thrifts. It's the OCC, Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, is the federal. Okay, so anyway, we have a bunch of regulators. The regulator that is the least effective and least committed to doing a good job is the Fed. So I would take it away from them because they are not good at it. If your central bank is good at doing it, let them do it. But in the case of the US, the Treasury is much better. The FDIC and the OCC are both under the Treasury, and they are much better regulators than the Fed is. So you may want them to do regulation there's no fundamental reason why central banks shouldn't be regulators. Minsky wanted the Fed to be more of a regulator, but what he wanted the Fed to do was to stop providing reserves through open market operations. When central banks buy bonds, they put reserves into the system. Minsky didn't want them to do that. He wanted them to supply reserves only at the discount window. So banks would have to come to the Fed to actually borrow reserves. They couldn't just borrow them in the Fed funds market. That way the Fed would see what they were doing. Say, okay, you want to borrow reserves? We want to look at your balance sheets and see why you're coming to us. And that way they could control them. So he thought that was a good idea, but he lost that battle. The Fed doesn't do that. They don't supply very many reserves from the discount window. So regulation, yes. Government bank, I think was the last topic. So around the world, I don't remember how many, but there's hundreds of development banks, public development banks that are run as part of the government. The US government does have loan programs. So we have small business loans, for example. We have student loans. They used to come from the government, then the government decided to privatize a lot of that. So now we sort of have a mixture. Government loan programs. We don't have a government development bank. So yes, that could be a good idea. Brazil has a very successful one. In the United States, one of our states, one of the Dakotas, I always forget if it's north or south, has a state bank. And there's a big push in the United States to establish state banks so that the states would have their own bank. And then you use those to promote investment, public investment in the economy. So yeah, government banks is probably a good idea, and government loan programs.
I have a last question. You mentioned Marx as one of the, your reference for the approach. I wanted to hear a comment from you because, well, as you know, a lot of Marxists use the commodity theory money, and how do you interpret Marx? And also, we were just discussing about monetary sovereignty and the possibility that people won't accept states' money. So how do you interpret this kind of phenomena?
Well, the third lecture, I am going to talk about Marx. So just the brief answer is that you can find passages in Marx in which he is talking about gold commodity money. So it's there. Why is it there? That I'm not sure. I don't think it's consistent with the rest of his arguments. And maybe he was giving an example because there was the British example of the time with, as I said, a strong link to gold that had been going on for over 300 years at the time that he's writing. So maybe he's talking about this specific case. You can, the way that I view a gold standard is gold is not money, even on a gold standard. What you have done is you have pegged the price of gold. What you have done is ensured what the price of gold will be by promising to convert your currency to gold. So you're going to supply or demand gold at this fixed price. So you peg the price of gold. That's all it does. It doesn't make gold money at all. And the problem for a Marxist who believes that that is Marx's theory, that it's based on the commodity gold and the number of hours it takes to produce an ounce of gold, is gold standards are extremely rare and they don't exist anywhere anymore. Then you have no theory of money for the vast majority of historical experience and for the capitalist experience today, for modern capitalism, which we can debate about when that begins, but maybe around 1870 is When we get modern capitalism, then it doesn't apply. Then Marxist theory doesn't apply. So that seems to be a problem to me. So I don't accept it. I think you can find a different interpretation of Marx in other writing. On the sovereign currency thing, I think, so we say, you know, if you impose obligations, fees, fines, and taxes on the population, then they must accept the currency or face the consequences of not paying the taxes if you only accept your own currency. Okay? Now, that's logic. Okay? And so a lot of times you'll hear this argument from MMT. The problem with logic is that as Joan Robinson always said, the conclusions are contained in the assumptions. So the assumption here is that the sovereign has the power to impose this on you and can enforce it. Okay? Well, the problem when you look back in history, kings had a lot of trouble imposing these obligations and even more in enforcing them. How do we know that? First, they had very high penalties, death, or they would heat up a coin red hot and burn it into your forehead if you refuse the king's coin. So you spend the rest of your life walking around with a symbol on your forehead to let other people see what happens to you. Well, if they had to do that, that tells you something, right? It wasn't so easy. And we know that they had problems issuing their liabilities. The crowns of Europe commonly had to borrow from Italian bankers. That also tells you something. It wasn't so simple to just impose obligations and issue a currency. They actually had to borrow Italian currency or bullion in order to spend in their own country. So the real world is a lot harder and more complicated than that. And it's related to sovereign power, related to trust in government. And if you go say, oh, the rich developed countries, there is absolutely no problem for the government. No problem at all. The taxes are imposed, other fees and fines are imposed, and they're enforced reasonably well. So the currency is demanded by everybody. There is no problem at all. They have also integrated the sovereign currency into the banking system. And I talk about in the paper that you can read that this was a major innovation and a brilliant thing that Parliament did when they took the power of the purse away from the king and gave it to themselves. And then what they did was they said that the Bank of England is going to allow banks to convert their own notes into Bank of England notes. Okay, brilliant. Because that makes Bank of England notes more desirable. Because the private banks are going to promise to deliver those. That put them at the top of the pyramid. Bank of England was not a government bank. It was created to finance the government, but it was private. It was competing in the marketplace with all the other banks. But when Parliament said private banks can make their notes convertible into Bank of England notes, that immediately put them at the top. Okay, and that's the way all of our systems operate now. The central bank is at the top because everybody's deposits are convertible into reserves. Okay, so were they brilliant in foreseeing this? Maybe not that brilliant, but they were on the right track. What they did was they put the state money into the private banking money, what's called a giro, the circuit, and that made the government money desirable. So that's, in addition to the tax enforcement, it is you put the two monetary systems together. and everyone sees them as being equivalent. So there's no problem in the rich countries. In developing countries, you will have alternatives to the sovereign currency. So maybe you price housing in a Latin American country in US dollars, not in your domestic currency. Why do you do that? Stability of the currency, right? Both inflation and exchange rate. So there is a competition with an external currency. So again, it gets more complicated in the real world. When I went to Kazakhstan, and there were some things you could only buy with US dollars, and then other things you could buy with the tang. And sort of ironically, you could only buy your visa with US dollars, which is paying the state. The state wouldn't take its own currency when you bought a visa to enter the country because they wanted US dollars. So you can have competition among currencies. And building up the sovereign power of the state in terms of lots of things, including currency, can be difficult. So it's more complicated than just saying, oh, you impose a tax. It may be hard to impose a tax. You might get a revolution, get revolts. You might get thrown out of power. Lots of bad things can happen before you get the power of a sovereign currency.
Bueno,
Nos esperamos mañana a las 11 en punto y vamos a tener la presentación y después hacemos un break para que ustedes puedan hacer todas las preguntas y traigan todas sus dudas para que podamos aprovechar la venida del doctor Randall Wright. Muchísimas gracias.
Nada más, para los que no tengan el programa, manden un correo al correo que aparece ahí en el cartel, que es Curso Redefim, ¿no? Para hacerles llegar el programa. ¿Vale? Bueno, nos vemos mañana. Gracias. Y bueno, también por si no sabían, para mañana a las 5 tenemos conferencia en la Facultad de Economía, ¿no? Entonces en el Narciso Basol, por si no pueden venir mañana temprano, nos vemos por ahí. Y con traducción simultánea.